You're listening to episode 282 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Miles Kessler joins us to speak about the intersection of mindfulness and Aikido. There are principles of mindfulness, however one chooses to define or not try to define that term, which can manifest in a wide variety of human endeavors. Perhaps those most dependent on awareness, intentionality, balance, and the courageous engagement with others coming to us in conflict. There are good examples. Today's guest explores how that shows up in his own teaching of martial arts. Miles Kessler is an American teacher of Aikido, meditation, and integral practice. He is the founder and director of the Integral Dojo in Tel Aviv, as well as the non-profit organization Aikido Without Borders in Israel-Palestine. For close to 20 years, he has been producing Aikido events such as Aikido Practice and Inquiry, Integral Aikido Intensives, the Dead Sea Seminar, Meditation for Aikidoka, and the Aikido at the Leading Edge Telesummit. His mission is to support people who are committed to Aikido, meditation, mindfulness, personal development, embodiment, and integral practice. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Dragon Dharma tea. Our guest today is Miles Kessler. Miles, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted. I'm happy to be here.
Very glad to have you here. It's been a while since we've had someone from the martial arts talking about how this practice overall, whether it's martial arts, meditation, how they relate. So very glad to have you here with us. So let's start by having you tell us about your background with Aikido and meditation.
Great. Well, first, thanks for inviting me. It was nice to, upon receiving your invitation, I actually checked you out, and I love the work you're doing with secular Buddhism, and I've listened to a handful of the podcasts, and it's beautiful stuff. So I'm very inspired by what you're doing, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I guess why I'm here is our life paths kind of unfold in a very kind of random, sometimes meandering way. But looking back, it tends to be very kind of specific milestones along the path that bring us to where we're at today. And I guess I could, if I go back all the way to when I was 3, I had some, I think, it was a very unusual experience for me at that time. But I suspect it was because I have 2 small children now. I suspect it's not so uncommon for children, but this was something that really stuck with me. I was sitting, I imagine I was around 3. I don't remember specifically my age, but I was sitting on my front porch in Farmers Branch, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, and playing with a little goofy doll. And I suddenly had what I would call today an experience of non-conceptual reality, pure witnessing. What I would call today. Then my 3-year-old mind had no idea what it was and how to reference it. But it stuck with me my whole life, my whole childhood. And it was this kind of, for the first time, I think I woke to some type of non-conceptual direct experience of reality, pure observer, pure witness. And it was always there in my consciousness as a reference point. Maybe it lasted 10 minutes or something, it was maybe even less, I don't know. But the fact is that it just stayed with me as a memory, as a reference point, which I had no idea what it meant as a child. I went about my childhood. I was very kind of sporty. I was outside playing all the time. And I was really, really inspired by anything that would go to get me into flow. So school didn't do it for me. Housework didn't do it for me. Of course, I did those things, but it was outside playing and doing sports and later martial arts. And in the flow, I was just like, and the three qualities of flow are timelessness, effortlessness, and selflessness. And that was something that always just drove me forward, and somehow was connected to that childhood experience. And then I just, I went through kind of a more or less normal childhood with, good times and challenging times. And, as we grow up, we suffer a certain amount. And I was always looking for a way out of that suffering, and that reference point was somehow in there. So as I grew up, I heard about Buddhism. I heard about, certain concepts, which I didn't grow up in a Buddhist culture at all, America. And the concept of karma and the concept of Buddhism, and there's a spiritual path, and then later Bruce Lee, and even later than that, Carlos Castaneda and his, and Don Juan's the practice of impeccability, and these things stuck in my mind, and it was connected to that reference point, and I was just drawn into anything that would kind of take me back to that place, even though I wasn't necessarily seeking what I woke to as a 3-year-old. It was a reference point that everything else in life was somehow in contrast to. And that took me, I did a lot of sports growing up, but then it was really the martial arts where I started finding that, okay, I'm on a path here that can lead me to some perfection or some impeccability, or some what I would say now is some experience of the absolute dimension. That just drove me forward in my life, and I did a lot of different martial arts, but then I'd found Aikido when I was 25 years old. And I was 22 years old. And, it's kind of the first time I had some money, I had a car, I had free time to do it. And I just went for it full on. And in a way, never turned back. I'm 54 today. So that's it's been a nonstop journey. And at the age of 25, that search, seeking, let's just say seeking enlightenment through the martial arts, took me on my path forward to Japan, where I kind of, I closed up all my loose ends in the States, and I moved to Japan to study Aikido with the masters, and I ended up in kind of the mecca of Aikido, the home of the founder of Aikido. And I stayed there at his dojo for a year as a live-in student, kind of a disciple. And then for the next 7 years, I lived in a house a few minutes away. And I spent basically the next 8 years in Japan developing myself in the martial art of Aikido, excelling, really kind of, and it was a hardcore school. So it was really kind of traditional, and very traditional, by the way. It just drove me through this developmental process. And there's a lot of interesting things about it, but I started to realize that what I was really seeking, Aikido is one of these martial arts that has a spiritual core. And it was, the founder of Aikido, his name is Morihei Ueshiba. He was called O-sensei. He had an awakening. He was already like one of the top martial artists in Japan in his day. And he was also a serious seeker, doing a lot of really austere, meditative practices and chanting and all this stuff. This kind of Shinto, kind of Shingon Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism practices that he was doing. And then at the height of his career, he was in his 50s, he had an awakening, like what appeared to be a full-blown enlightenment. And in the midst of his Aikido training, in the midst of his martial arts training, and his martial arts was transformed into Aikido. It was expressed, what he started expressing was Aikido. And Aikido means the way of harmony with nature, or the way of harmony with the universal forces of nature. So Aikido, from the very beginning, it was clear to me that it was a spiritual practice. It was meant to be a spiritual path, even though it's not as clear, there's not such a clear step or eightfold path like in Buddhism. That's why I was attracted to Aikido. And yet I was in Japan. The founder had passed away already for 30 years. And what was being taught in Japan, to a large extent, great stuff, wonderful, deep stuff with a beautiful philosophy to it. Also a lot of egoic stuff happening. But what was being taught was actually not a path towards awakening, but rather a path with a lot of dogma and a lot of secular, not sectarian differences and style differences, and and as for and then all the normal human stuff. And even though I was excelling in my martial art, I was looking around. I wasn't seeing any, and I was with a lot of the top teachers in Japan, and I saw all the top teachers in Japan, but I wasn't seeing anything that anybody who had a really strong Dharma transmission. And I started to realize that, I basically, after a few years of kind of bumping up to the glass ceiling and wanting to grow beyond that, I realized that what I was looking for, I wasn't finding in Japan. I wasn't finding in the martial arts. And even though there's obviously Zen is alive and well in Japan, I wasn't drawn to Zen. I was always drawn more to the insight meditation, the Vipassana meditation. And I was living there. I was doing I did a Course in Miracles, by myself for 1 year. And then I started meditating on my own informally with, reading the books of Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein, big inspirations for me. And they talked about U Pandita, this guy in Burma, that's their teacher, and blah, blah, blah. And I kept hearing his name. And it's like, okay, well, and my teacher in Japan was kind of the U Pandita of Aikido. His name was Saito Sensei. He was the successor of the founder, etc. And after 8 years of being satisfied with my practice there, not really fulfilled with the Aikido training, fulfilled with the life and the culture and my experience in Japan, I realized that I was seeking for something more, and it was that spiritual dimension, and that I was not getting it there. I finished my life in Japan, and I moved on. I went directly to Burma and started practicing there. It was one of these things where I was just going to do a 1-year trip before moving back to the States and opening a dojo or something. And I figured, maybe I'll just pop in and practice with the Pandita for months, get enlightened, enjoy the rest of the year on the beaches of Thailand or someplace like that, and then go home and start my life. So that 1-year trip ended up being like an 8-year trip, and every winter I would go back to Burma and then later Nepal for like anywhere from 3 months to 10 months retreat. And that was I had been in Buddhist culture. In Japan, there's a lot of Buddhist culture, a lot of Zen culture. It's just everywhere. But that was really my first formal entry into Buddhism, and, taking the precepts and then, formally becoming a student and doing intensive retreats. Yeah. And it made all the difference, and it was a tough, you're also the Vipassana practitioner, right? Yeah. So it's a haul. It can be a tough practice. It's a very rewarding practice, very insightful practice. And I have, even though, you know how it is. You really got to push a lot of stuff aside in your life to make space to go on retreat for longer periods of time. And the things that I was pushing aside, my life wasn't so complicated, but I did have to push aside my Aikido career. I had to push aside, my relationship with my Aikido teacher. Push aside, really kind of put a priority before that. Push aside relationships, push aside professional, things, and push aside family. I shouldn't say push aside family, because I was still seeing my family every year, but putting the practice as a priority. And now I'm fully ensconced in the marketplace. After that 8 years, it was very clear that, I needed to return to the marketplace, which is a whole nother practice. I can't tell you how many times I wanted to run back to the monastery. I'm deeply in the marketplace here in the middle of Tel Aviv. I run my own dojo. I have an online business, and I'm married, 2 children at home, and yeah, it's an interesting process.
Thanks for that comprehensive background. It's fascinating to hear how there was this trajectory of martial arts engagement, and that hitting that glass ceiling, as you said, that there was still some gap to be filled. There was something more, and you had that sensibility from a very, very young age, which is nice to have that bright shining moment of, there's something else.
Right. Yeah.
And you had mentioned this. There's some associations between Aikido and contemplative practice. Would you say a bit more about that, how those are related?
Sure. I mean, the thing about Aikido, it is a spiritual martial art. There are other spiritual martial arts. And when I speak about spiritual, I mean that that at the core of it, there's an absolute dimension, an absolute state, an experience or discovery of the absolute, which is you, which is us, or not us, as the case may be, or not who we think we are. It's like in Buddhism, it's resting on non-self, or you could even say it's resting on the practice of mindfulness, which is universal, all times, all places, all circumstances practice. And because of that, it has endured 2,500 years of cultural upheavals and changes and moving and being imported and exported, etc. And it is it endures because of that. Because at the core, there's the timeless non-self dimension or non-dual dimension, depending on your tradition. Aikido also has that dimension, and yet it is not so clear-cut like Buddhism. It's 70 years old Aikido, not 2,500 years old. But the spiritual, Aikido is of other martial arts, Qigong and Tai Chi, these are, Qigong is not exactly a martial art, but it fits in that category. Tai Chi is a spiritual martial art. It's based on the Tao. And yet, part of its design is still to harm another person. Some of the moves, even though they're spiritual moves, here I'm breaking the arm, here I'm punching the nose, and fine, it's not real fighting, but it's a beautiful art, and it's got the spiritual dimension, but it is still a win-lose scenario, or a zero-sum game. Aikido is the only martial art that is not a zero-sum game, that is a win-win situation, and it's the only 100% life-affirming martial art. Now, how can that be? It's the midst of a conflict. As postmodernists get this. This is what we're always looking for, with nonviolent communication, dialogues, and really trying to kind of work things out. Not being a pacifist and not being necessarily an activist is like, one of the koans that I've kind of worked with in Aikido, it's just kind of came up to me, in Aikido work, martial arts is a model of conflict. It's a practice model of conflict. So you can put this into a conflict, you can put this into your training. But the koan is, I'm not aggressive. I'm not passive. I'm not passive aggressive. What am I? So holding this koan, enter like a warrior, a spiritual warrior, into a conflict, and really see that in a conflict, we're either being aggressive or we're either being passive, fight, flight, or either being passive aggressive, which is just another way to control things, but not look like you're controlling things. That's just what the ego does. That's what we do when our caveman and cavewoman brains are activated, or even our kind of social brains are activated. We kind of move, we approach, or we avoid, or we kind of play a game, and we control the power. Normal human stuff. And, there's many martial arts, and beautiful, like really beautiful martial arts that happen to be competitive, or even they're just arts. But there's always, you're either being aggressive or passive aggressive. And Aikido, there's plenty of people. In fact, most of us, when we're in Aikido, we're playing one of those three games, but it's not the art. So when you think into the principles of the art, like first being grounded and centered, then deeply connected, and through that deep connection, awakening to the fact that another person is there, and allowing them to kind of come into contact and connection with you, in that moment, in the middle of a conflict, creative resolutions arise. And they're, the thing about these kind of creative revolutions, it's like a spiritual emergence, because they're always unpredictable. True resolution is when both people are fully satisfied with the outcome. That's not zero-sum game. Is like, let's say you and I equal 100%. We're in a conflict. Somebody wins the conflict. Let's say you win. You get your 100% satisfaction. I got 0%. Or if you mostly win, you'll have a certain percentage of the satisfaction. I'll have a less percentage. Or we can make that kind of, that postmodern move and agree to disagree, which is better. Agreeing to disagree is better, but it's still, you're only 50% satisfied and I'm 50% satisfied. But at least I don't get 50% satisfied at your expense and you don't get it at my expense. So it's kind of, we make this move to the middle, or we like agree to disagree, which is certainly better than zero sum, but actually it's still zero sum. It still equals 50, it still equals 100%. Whereas in the Aikido resolution of conflict, which again happens magically, there's nothing you can do to make it happen. We can do a lot to set the conditions, but then it arises through grace. we're both not just 100% satisfied, but the satisfaction is completely multiplied. And, you feel like, yes, this is exactly where I needed to go. I feel like, yes, this is where I needed to go. And we both feel like, yes, this is exactly where the situation needed to go. And that's the model and practice, and not just the philosophy, but the spiritual core of Aikido.
So, how do you incorporate a contemplative practice, a formal contemplative practice, into your teaching of Aikido? If you do, well, what does that look like?
In our day-to-day practice, because there is a curriculum. Pablo Picasso had this beautiful saying, learn the rules like a pro so you can break the rules like an artist. And for all of us contemplatives, we've got a pretty more or less good discipline, and certainly following the rules, because practice implies that there are certain methodologies that we take on and we commit to. And then higher path of practice, everything that's lower in us, our basic instincts and our fears, desires of the ego are going to be challenged as we practice along that path of higher development. So many people, past practitioners, have a more or less good relationship with discipline. And even as contemplatives, we have a lot of rules. We're learning the rules like a pro. We're learning the practices and methodologies. But really, we want to be free and come to a place in our life where we just naturally express the Dharma. The natural expression of the Dharma needs no rules, has no rules. It's just a beautiful, expression. And even in Vipassana, they say path consciousness and beyond. As that awakening matures, the sila, you don't reduce the sila, but the need for sila lessens, because sila just becomes a natural expression of who you are. But prior to that, we need the sila in morality, and I guess everybody on this podcast knows what sila is. We kind of need it to keep the ego in check. And certainly we need ethical, moral guidelines to keep the ego in check. But as we awaken, the need for those guidelines are less, because we're naturally able to express the Dharma, and which is always ethical and always moral at its essence. Yeah, certainly, maybe not in every situation, but certainly the Dharma itself is like that. So we learn the rules like a pro, so we can break the rules like an artist. And Picasso was a genius at this, because he created a whole wave of creative movement. And in Aikido, there's a lot of learning the rules like a pro. So we do a lot of technical training that is not, I wouldn't necessarily say it's contemplative, but it does have the function of somehow training or training the ego to be on a path. But eventually, what we want to do is we want to start to have free expression of the principles of Aikido, which are all like creative and spontaneous and flowing and centered and grounded and connected, etc. So when I'm doing my day-to-day practice here, there's quite a bit of curriculum, quite a bit of technical training, but we always begin with meditation. We always finish with meditation, and often there'll be principle-based points throughout the class, where we actually drop out of the external forms of doing the external experience of doing forms and drop into a direct experience of universal principles. When I teach more of a seminar or a weekend retreat through Aikido, or even a day seminar or a day workshop, these workshops are usually principle-based. So I teach very little technique, and we begin with things like grounding and centering and connection and flow and creativity and spontaneous response, and there's methods and practices that we use, but these in their essence are contemplative. Whenever we get, because the only way you can experience the universal principles of center and ground and connection and flow is if we drop out of conceptual reality. Our conceptual relationship to the world actually prevents us from having a direct experience of connection. That the layers of the self have to relax. And, we have lots of practices. And you could say, even though we're active and we're moving and we're doing things, these are contemplative practices, because they require that we work through the structures of the ego, that we relax the boundaries of the ego.
So how are the students responding to this? What's been your experience with them?
Well, everything under the sun. Look, if the students are practicing Aikido, there's a good chance that they're already kind of seeking something that's a little bit more spiritual and or philosophical. I live here in Israel. And Israel is a kind of everybody every man and every Israeli man and woman does the army. Israel still, even though it's these days, it's quiet, touch wood, Israel's still in officially at war with several countries in the Middle East. And you can feel the tension and the trauma from that whole experience is right under the social surface. So here, people are a little bit more looking for the martial part of the art. When I teach in Europe and in the States, people that come to my seminars are more looking for it's a gross generalization, but they're more looking for the art side of the martial art, and some are even looking for the spiritual side of the martial art because they know that that's what I bring. So it depends on where I'm at culturally, but there's always I make it clear that we're moving from the material towards the spiritual, and the actual essence of Aikido can only be understood in the spiritual dimension.
Yeah, it's interesting, this cultural distinction that you make, that depending on where you are, and even as you mentioned, the feeling tone in Israel now is a little different, but there's still tension there. And comparing
totally.
that to Europe or America, and that what the people coming to your classes are seeking might be a little bit different, and you're aware of that.
Yeah. And the way they interpret what you're doing is also different. And, it comes through experience, but you develop this kind of intuitive sense of who you're with and who you're speaking to and how to be with them and how to speak with them. And how, if as teachers, if we really want to help the people that we're working with to evolve and or awaken, then we have to kind of, the skillful means of Paya. We have to meet them where they're at and give them the right thing that can turn their mind or turn their heart in one little increment even. So that's a skill that gets developed only through teaching, and only, the more, it certainly gets developed as a student, with our own practice, with our teachers. They're turning us all the time, pleasantly or unpleasantly, but they're turning us. And then we learn through that experience how to, help others. And then, we go through, hopefully we don't make too many mistakes, but we go through that same process with our students. And, if you're within your culture, then you can go really deep and far because you're speaking literally the same cultural language. But if you also work in different cultures, you've got to learn how to give transmission in different ways so that it can reach people.
So what else do you want to share with the listeners? Maybe something about integral practice or something else that comes to mind for you?
Well, sure. And I don't know how many integralists are listening to this, but one of the things that's nice about it's just like, you remember The Matrix when Neo at the end, it's a great Buddhist movie. When Neo at the end, when he has the physical death, which is a metaphor of his ego death, he reawakens and he sees the code of what is, the perceived reality, the matrix, and the code is of zeros and ones. It's of zeros and ones. And it's the same thing for the Vipassana yogis listening to this. The code that we begin to awaken to around the fourth stage of insight knowledge, beginning at the third stage and then the fourth stage and beyond, is the three universal characteristics. And that repeated contemplation of anicca, dukkha, anatta, of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self, the repeated contemplation of that helps us understand that is the code of existence. That is, those three universal characteristics are universal, all physical, non-physical phenomena, everywhere, forever, and always was, always will be. And we get deep, we deeply sink into that code, and it changes who we are. It changes, it's certainly, that's the agent that transforms the ego. So it's the same thing with integral. It's just this beautiful understanding that there's a code to human culture, to human knowledge. And it's defined in just 5 very basic ways. It's called Akwo, which I won't even go into here. It can be very mindy. But one of the 5 categories, one of the categories of human knowledge is the idea of vertical development. That we evolve through levels from more egoistic perspective to the capacity to take more and more perspectives out there in the world until we have this kind of multi-perspectival view of reality. And this vertical development is also something that's beautifully transmitted in Aikido. And in this sense, it's a total spiritual evolution that happens through the practice. And if you think of our most basic kind of, and by the way, this is kind of the code of evolution in Aikido too. I call it the evolution of response. And, if you think of our most basic way to deal with conflict, as human beings, we have boundaries. As non-spiritual human beings, we live within, a really identified strong set of boundaries. And sooner or later, usually sooner, those boundaries bump up against another boundary and we have conflict. And, really the basic survival level, when you're in the jungle, that conflict triggers just fight, flight, freeze. That's our basic response to fight, flight, freeze. And that's kind of the first level that we're born into. And hopefully it's healthy, and we're the ancestors of survivors, the people that survived fight, flight, freeze. So those genes, that genetic material has been passed on to us quite strongly. We need to appreciate it, that first it's intelligence. And second, we have to appreciate that it's deep inside of us. And you can't do Aikido from there. You can't be spiritual from there, basically. We have to evolve beyond that. And then the next stage of development in the evolution response, where we move out of responding to conflict through survival reactions, we move into an emotional reaction. So I no longer fight or kick you, but I control the conflict. I control the stress and the fear. And these are both fear-based. I control it through my emotions. So either, there's the approaching emotions like anger or a cynical joke, and there's the avoiding emotions like, playing the victim role or being completely passive or indifferent. But these are emotional controlling ways to control the situation. And it's also not Aikido. And it's not spiritual because it's still trapped within the ego. At a certain point, we kind of realize the games that we play, either the physical games, the survival games, or the emotional games that we play, we come to a level which is a level of choice, that we actually have the capacity to choose. This is the beginning of any path, including Buddhism. We choose to commit to something so-called higher. At that point, we move into what I'm calling centered awareness response. And this is really where Aikido begins. As I said before, Aikido is a higher path of development, just like Buddhism. And every step is a step of awareness and or mindfulness. And, we put awareness in the center of the context and the center of our body and the center of our mind. So that this stage where we really kind of begin to get over the perpetuation, or we start to break free of the inertia or the momentum of the perpetuation of conflict in stressful moments, we have to become centered. We have to become aware. It's called centered awareness response. And that's really what we're doing in our contemplative practice. We turn our attention from the outside world to the inside world, and we see how stress and conflict affects us, and we create a container of awareness. And as we create that container of awareness, all of my survival stuff can come up, but I can watch it come up and I can watch it pass away. All my emotional stuff can come up. I can watch it come up and watch it go away. The fear, which is really the base of it all, can come up, does its craziness, and then, if I have enough centered awareness, it can pass away. So if you think of a spiritual martial art, it's usually, the image you have of a samurai or, let's say a spiritual warrior is they've got this great capacity to not be shaken by fear in the midst of an attack or conflict. And that's the third stage in this, from survival reactions to emotional reactions to centered awareness response to stress. But then as we make that move, we begin to understand that now I have to turn the inward path to the outside and begin to connect with my partner. And it's a whole nother practice. It's a practice based on centered awareness. When I'm stabilized and centered aware and it's stable, then I can begin to turn my attention outward and work on connection and really start to connect with the other person. And if you connect deep enough, I begin to connect not with their outside, but I begin to connect with their inside. And this level is called intuitive response. That, before I respond to stress and conflict, just think of Aikido, it's an attack coming. I respond from my center and from my awareness. It's like you're like the empty mirror, and the image arises and you reflect it right back. That you're clean. But now I shift that awareness that, let's just say, it's kind of a non-dual awareness that starts to arise at this stage, but now you shift that into connecting with the other person, and you intuitively become aware of what they need. You intuitively become aware of where they're at emotionally, where they're at physically, relaxed or stressed, etc., you intuitively become aware of what their intention is. Not that you're psychic or anything like that. Maybe some people are, but I don't know. But you just start to kind of sense into them, and you connect with them on a deep level. You connect with them from their inside. You start to get their worldview. And this is a whole nother level of operation, and all the techniques that we learn in Aikido, they operate at all of those previous levels that I mentioned, but they have a completely different flavor when you're in centered awareness. And then when you're in intuitive awareness, it has another flavor, another essence to it. And that's kind of the height of what I can do alone. But if I happen to be practicing with another person who is also centered and aware, stable, and they connect with me intuitively, and I'm centered and aware, stable, and I connect with them intuitively, then what happens is we create a centered, aware, and intuitive system. And this really takes two to tango. It's beautiful, like in spiritual dialogue, you've probably experienced this. It really takes two to tango, and when you connect as a system, then a system's intelligence arises that is not me, and it's not you, and it's not just you plus me, but it's multiplied, and it only happens from your unique aware intuitive self and my unique aware intuitive self coming together in this unique system, and the system has its own intelligence. Then some very interesting things begin to happen, and that stage is called the creative response. And in conflict just starts to resolve automatically at that stage. The conflict is a natural adjustment of any situation, and in the moment every conflict has a solution that's waiting to happen, and they just begin to appear. And that's when you look at martial arts. If you look at Aikido, it seems that people are doing magical, crazy stuff, and throwing somebody across the room, or just like the most beautiful, graceful flow of two people, what looks like on the outside fighting, but on the inside it's not experienced that way at all. It just happens to be creative, and it's always spontaneous, it's always unpredictable, and it's always creative. And this kind of scale, this vertical development scale, this kind of an integral development, is called the evolution of response, and it's something that I've developed in the Aikido practice. Or it developed through me, I should say.
It's its own spontaneous horizon.
Yes, right. So even though I just kind of explained this kind of, this vertical development, or the way that this unfolds in Aikido, everybody can relate to this. And I'm sure your listeners also can relate to it. And everybody knows when they're stressed out and kind of in survival reflex. Hopefully it's not happening now, the fires in California, that freaks people out. We certainly know if you're a meditator, if you're somehow just halfway aware, when you're playing, or you're kind of caught up in these emotional games. That's obvious. And it's kind of natural that it happens. But since we're all practitioners here, what do you do when those things are going on? Usually, if you've got your wits about you, if you're halfway mindful, you'll stop and you'll check in with your body and you'll breathe. This is the beginning of everything. This is the centered awareness stage. And, so if you really want to kind of put this scale or this model into practice, as you centered and aware, if it's a little bit stable or if it's greatly stable, it doesn't matter. Then start practicing, start checking in, now start connecting with other people from that place. And most meditators are doing this automatically anyways. It's the integration part. We take it from the cushion into the world. But really start connecting with others there, and really see how, when you connect from the past, repeating emotional patterns or survival patterns for sure, when you connect with the past, the outcome is always the same. It's perpetuation of not harmony, whatever you want to call it. But when you connect with others from your center, it starts to bring an opportunity for something new to arise. And then notice if other people start to become available to connect with you. And that noticing is this kind of intuitive level, this intuitive response. And if you notice intuitively that people are starting to shift into where you're at, and they start to intuitively connect with you, then start to notice what happens in the dialogue, what happens in the interaction, what happens in the conversation. And see if it's not, you don't just move into your own flow, but see if the two of you don't move into flow together. And in essence, that's really what Aikido is. They're kind of prerequisites. From the outside, we can say, yeah, you have to be centered, and you have to be intuitive, and you have to be creative. But from the inside, there's no steps to take there. It really starts with your center. It starts with mindfulness. And it starts with sharing that mindfulness and intuitively getting the other person. And if they shift into intuitively getting you, and you can hold that, it doesn't freak you out, then start to see what miraculous things begin to arise. And that would just be the practice piece that I would love to leave people with.
Well, for those who are interested in finding out more, you can visit Miles' website, theintegraldojo.com. And of course, I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode. Miles, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, Ted, it was really wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.